The GSP Plus issue has contributed to some tension between Sri Lanka and the European Union. But what about Sri Lanka's relationship with the larger international community? I spoke with Dr. Saravanamuttu, Executive Director of the Centre for Policy Alternatives, to find out his views on the GSP Plus and also about the international community's involvement in Sri Lanka's internal affairs. The GSP Plus arrangement was suspended earlier this year, and since then there have been several reviews and discussions about its renewal. What is the status right now?
Well, as far as I understand it, if the EU does not change its mind, the suspension will go through by the 15th of August. I think what's important here to remember is that the European Union, after its investigation and the recommendation of suspension, talked about demonstrable progress. And the government of Sri Lanka, I suppose, needs to engage in this demonstrable action which will denote progress as seen from the point of view of the EU. But the point that needs to be emphasized is that this is not a negotiation. It is an agreement. There was ratification and effective implementation of 27 odd human rights instruments and international labor standards. The investigation focused on 3. They found us to be falling short in respect of them. And what they were saying was that if nothing is done substantively with regard to these things, the recommendation goes through. And this is the situation that we're in. We've had a government delegation go to Brussels, but I don't think anything really has come out of it in terms of any further progress. So the situation stands that if there is no dramatic progress between now and the 15th of August, that deadline will pass and it will stand suspended.
The public discourse on the GSP Plus issue has been mostly negative, both in terms of what the government is portraying and also in some of the media. It's being linked to sort of larger Western agenda that is aimed at controlling developing countries like Sri Lanka. So how would you see this?
I think this either stems from a misunderstanding or a deliberate distortion as to what GSP Plus is all about. As I said earlier, it is an agreement. We knew what the terms and conditions of GSP Plus were when we accepted GSP Plus. And what has happened so far is the workings of that agreement going through. At no stage does it say that Sri Lanka and the EU can negotiate on an extension. It is almost automatic in that respect. And so I think this is being caught up, as it were, in this whole argument that there is some sort of international conspiracy to effect regime change in this country and to be critical of Sri Lanka on human rights grounds, to ensure that there are war crimes tribunals against leading members of the government, etc. I think that only serves to confuse and distort the issue.
So, given this, where do you think Sri Lanka's relationship with the international community stands at the moment?
Well, the international community is not a monolith, as we all know. Relations with Europe and the other Western powers may be somewhat problematic insofar as all the voices of criticism with regard to human rights, with regard to impunity, etc., are coming largely from the Western powers, United States and Europe. So I think that's an issue that the government needs to address and demonstrate that it has a commitment and that it will fulfill that commitment in regard to addressing these issues. On a broader front, of course, the international community is much more plural now. There are the emerging countries like India and China and Iran and Brazil who have more economic clout and arguably more political clout as well. And this government has moved to align itself much more closely with them. If one looks, for example, in terms of developmental assistance that we get, it's the Chinese who are the key players. Then you have the multilateral institutions, the Japanese and the Indians. So, in a sense, the options available to us in terms of partners available amongst the international community are much greater than they were before. But we have to be very adroit and careful in ensuring that whoever we choose as partners, that we don't in a way alienate others.
The UN Secretary General's suggestion of setting up an expert panel to look into human rights violations in Sri Lanka. What are the implications of this if it does go through?
To begin with, it is an internal panel. It doesn't have the kind of validity that it would if it came as a consequence of a UN Security Council resolution, or indeed even a resolution of the General Assembly. This is something internal. There is mounting evidence and allegation of war crimes having been committed in respect to both sides. And I think prima facie there is a need to investigate this. And the UN should, because again, Ban Ki-moon harks back to the communique that was released after he visited Sri Lanka when the war ended last year, in which the whole question of accountability was to be addressed locally by the Sri Lankan government in the first instance. But there are a number of problems with the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission. I mean, and at the end of the day, I suppose there's a key issue. Can a government be expected to investigate itself?
But playing devil's advocate, the government keeps saying that it's too far, the UN is going too far. What do you think? Is this interference into internal country matters?
No, I certainly don't think so. I think the United Nations is there as a multilateral institution made up of member states to look at all sorts of issues, including the notion of sovereignty, in terms of sovereignty entails a duty, a responsibility on the part of a government to protect its own citizens. And if those citizens have been victims of an egregious wrong, then someone has to come forward and protect them and look at them. Membership of the international community, surely, at the end of the day, entails certain duties and responsibilities. Just declaring yourself a state doesn't mean that you can get away with anything and everything. Just think about it for a moment. I mean, there are people in this country who, in the last days of the war, probably had their fathers and brothers and sisters, etc., with them, and within days, they don't know where they are. They still don't know where they are. How do they move forward? Emotionally in terms of closure, practically in terms of getting on with their lives and livelihoods into the future. Also, very importantly, is this, is that as far as the Tamil community in this country is concerned, July 1983 is a key event in the collective psyche and memory of the Tamil community in respect to the behavior of the Sri Lankan state. May 2009 could well, achieve those proportions unless there's an investigation, because it's an investigation into what the LTT did as well as what the Sri Lankan government may and may not have done. It's important that we have the truth out there, and then from that baseline that we proceed forward.
Bringing the conversation back to GSP Plus, finally, its renewal will involve the government's adherence to certain human rights conventions and also practices of good governance. Given these conditions, do you think that the GSP Plus will be granted to Sri Lanka once again?
Well, I mean, as it stands, the position is that the EU has recommended suspension, right? And that suspension will come into effect, I think, after the 15th of August. So between now and the 15th of August, it's up to the government of Sri Lanka to take what they call demonstrable steps to change the situation, or else the suspension stands. No, quite frankly, I don't. Quite frankly, I don't, and that's a real, absolutely sad. It's a real tragedy, because here was an opportunity for us to improve and strengthen human rights protection mechanisms in this country and keep a very important and valuable trade concession. It's a missed opportunity, and it's really, really unfortunate and sad.
We're going in for a quick break, but when we come back, we look once again at the issue of women in politics. Stay with us.